Hello and welcome back to the FEZ show, the last show of the week as it's Friday. So if this is your first show that you are looking at, then after this you can go back and look through all the other shows and catch up. Also, if you're enjoying the content, then remember to hit that like button and then press that little red button to subscribe if you're also enjoying the action so you don't miss a single show. We have a great guest lineup for you today. Joining me on the left corner is the one and only Chris Stevens, a former Formula E journalist, part of the Mixed Apex podcast. And on the right, joining me as ever, is Jack Pickering. Morning, Chris. Morning, Jack.
Morning.
Morning.
Oh, it's great to have you on the show today. We got a really interesting sort of topics to talk about today, and I'm going to get straight into it because late last night, Formula E just popped out this little story that the Gen 2 Evo car will be delayed, and there's obviously a load more cost-saving sort of techniques that they're going to introduce, obviously to combat COVID-19. So, Chris, I'm just going to throw it over to you straight away. What did you think about the announcement of the Gen 2 car being delayed, and obviously what Formula E then proposed for each team to do?
So I wasn't surprised about the Gen 2 Evo at all, because it makes perfect sense. I mean, being realistic about our options, we're not going motor racing this year. Certainly, we're not going to get Formula E season in by August, purely because motor racing is not a priority right now. You know, of all the sports in general, like they might get the Premier League back on before anything else, but just the amount of international travel that goes into motorsport just means it's impossible until at least the autumn or even the winter. So delaying Gen 2 Evo was not a surprise at all. The thing that I was then quite surprised about was the cost saving measures, or at least the way they went about it, because I always thought, their cost-saving measures would come in the form of, you can only have X personnel and you can't have people working at the factory during race weekends, and you're only allowed this amount of time in the simulator and stuff like that. Whereas they seem to have just gone with a very blunt approach of now a car has to last 2 years. And from what I can sort of make out of my head, so obviously manufacturing parts, you only have to do that once every 2 years now, so there's a saving there. But I feel like the actual development won't change all that much, because they'll still be spending 2 years worth of money in the 2 year period, and it will just all come on the car at once. But it's definitely going to help, that's for sure.
No, it's really interesting because teams now have the opportunity. They can either build this new car for season 7, but they've got to run with it for season 8, or they can carry on with their season 6 car that they've got this year, run that into season 7, and then build a new car for season 8. So I think, Jack, it puts teams in a predicament. Like, what do you do if you're an Audi right now? You've sort of made a dog of a car for season 6. Do you continue that for season 7? And just deal with it and really put emphasis into season 8. It's like a massive rule regulation change, I feel, where you deal with it and then you focus your energy on your season 8 car and you make a new one. Or do you make a new car for season 7, hope that it works, and continue that into season 8? It's a catch-22 that teams will find themselves in.
Yeah, completely. Firstly, I think it's a fantastic idea what they've done there to delay the Gen 2 Evo and put this 2-year cycle in place. I reckon it's going to be pretty even split in terms of what teams will do. As you said, Audi, they could create a new car for season 7 to ensure that it's fighting more at the front than this season, but also so like to cheater BMW, they'll probably keep their same cars for next season. But also you have to think, because the new chassis is coming in season 8, a lot of teams may also want to use the gap between season 7 and season 8 to develop their powertrains. I think maybe I'm not completely sure on I'm not 100% sure on how it works, but whether whether Neo can switch powertrains during the summer or autumn, as it probably will be now, um, is one thing that I'd quite like to see if that's possible, and if so, if they have to stick for 2 seasons. But yeah, there are quite a few teams that I reckon will stick because it's going to be the same chassis, same engine. You might as well develop a new powertrain for the new chassis in season 8.
I gotta say that, and I'm gonna criticize the series a little bit here, and anyone who's listened to me on like any other show will know that I hate doing it, but I will do because I love Formula E, and I will like criticize where I think is necessary. But I'm not a huge fan of the idea of retaining a car for an extra season, just in general. It kind of makes sense in, say, like MotoGP, for example, where you're selling the old bikes to your customer teams, but still the factory team gets a new bike, or at least a development, and so the idea of keeping just the exact same car for 2 years, I'm not really a fan of, and at least though with this system where like, oh, you could do it now if you want, or you could wait a season. That at least means we're gonna get maybe some swapping around of the orders. I think they're risking kind of breaking up this pack of 8 teams that can all win races on any given day. But then we have seen like in season 2. For example, there are a couple of teams still running a sort of pushed version of the season 1 powertrain, and they both teams ended up scoring podiums that season. So there's an argument, for that as well. I do think we will see quite a big shift in what Formula E becomes in terms of like the pack.
Yeah, that was my next question actually, was what do we understand about this 2-year gap? Is it going to continue this 2-year gap into, say, once we come to season 8, we're back to a 2-year gap, so you can either make your powertrain for season 9, but you've got to keep it, or so forth, or is it just, how do you understand it, Chris? Because you might understand it a little bit better than me. Is it something that they're just doing for this 2 years to cope with the problems that we've had with COVID-19? Or is this something more long-term? Is this something that they're going to run this as their model for years to come?
So that I don't have a definitive answer on that. I kind of hope it is just a COVID-19 response, because I think doing every year it makes sense, and that the whole point is that you're pushing the technology. Whereas if you just leave it for an extra year, then it doesn't help that image quite so much, I think. I mean, obviously, Formula E is still going to be pushing the absolute limits of what an EV can do in a racing sense, but it doesn't really help the image when you're just leaving it for a year, even if other teams are introducing new cars or whatever, and you end up with that big swap around. So because we've seen that other cost saving measures come in sort of slightly better ways, or slightly more sort of nuanced ways. We're always saying, how do we cut costs without taking away from the show? Like in Formula 1, where they're talking about the heavier parts and all this, and you can cut this, and then all the cars will look the same. Formula E doesn't really have that problem because it's advertised as a semi-spec series, but open powertrains. So there are still loads of avenues that you can use to cut costs, but you'll never see them, and therefore it doesn't take away from the show.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking, because I think it'd be odd if they did carry on that 2-year cycle forever, because then obviously pushing the technology, which is what we want to do, would be difficult. But I wanted to move on to sort of the cost, because obviously it's quite timely. I had a conversation yesterday with Trevor Carlin, and he was talking about obviously when Formula E first started to actually have a team, and he was talking about possibly moving into that sort of team element style and bringing Carlin potentially into Formula E alongside Mahindra when he was partnered with Mahindra in season 1. He said it was about $3-6 million dollars to start up a Formula E team. He said now the prices are astronomical, if I can even say that word. Like, they're so high that, a team like Carlin, you'd have to have serious backing now to get into Formula E, which obviously probably shows the progress Formula E has made over 6 years, that it was a small, tiny little championship, didn't cost much to get in. Now, you need serious funding.
It's
Jack,
the price of World Championship status.
Indeed, and obviously which would be going into next season. But Jack, in terms of cost cutting and being cost effective, Formula E's prices obviously in these 6 years have obviously risen dramatically. What do you think, they could possibly maybe do more of to make sure that costs don't go way too high, essentially?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. But one thing that I do remember is when we had when we had 11 teams a couple of years ago. They advertised that 12th team spot for something like 24 million. So I'm not that surprised that the prices with owning a Formula E team has gone up massively. But also, as the series has gone on and with more manufacturers, obviously the revenue goes up and up and up. The thing is with Formula E, they already have they already have standard parts. As Chris said, it's a semi spec series anyways, and the only place that you can really mess about is with the powertrain. So that's good enough in terms of like not too much investment is needed, but in terms of like lower costs, it doesn't help that there's inflation year on year. But yeah, I'm not really sure on what Formula E could really do there.
Because I remember back in season 2, right? But then when they were at the time, they could only, I think it was the motor and the inverter, and everything else from season 1 was basically the same. And those were the only two things that teams could actually like work on, apart from obviously the software of their powertrain. But in terms of the hardware, it was the inverter and the motor. And I remember speaking to Alejandro Agag. Oh, gearbox as well. Well done. And I remember speaking to Alejandro Agag, and he was like, it's simply to keep costs down. But obviously, as the technology keeps improving, Chris, the prices are going to go up. So they might have to maybe do what Formula One's maybe doing and putting in some sort of like proper cost cap that make that proper public, so costs already don't go out of control.
The stupid thing is, it's the same formula.
Yeah.
It's still the same parts you can work on. The teams have just suddenly got a lot more backing, and obviously the arrival of Porsche, having Porsche in has changed the game, right? Because I know we talk about how there's 10 different manufacturers in Formula E, or however many. Oh no, it's 9 now actually. But and you assume they all bring like big bucks, and that is true from a sort of commercial point of view. But then you bring in somebody like Porsche, who just tips the balance astronomically. And because they have got so much more resource than any other team, I'm not surprised at all that they came in and scored a podium on their first weekend. Because, frankly, if they didn't, I think that would be a little bit disappointing for a team with so much available, at their disposal, and so many fantastic drivers as well. And even Mercedes were worried about the money that Porsche were bringing. So that just tells you. So I think it's more we're dealing with like one or two teams to help save the other 10, and for that you have a very, very strong case to help with that.
No, for sure. And it's amazing how far the series has come. But I want to sort of move on now, because this was some sort of topic that we were looking forward to talking about, and it was the stories, because we've all been in the paddock. And it was the stories that we've been in. And I've got a story, so I'll kick off. Because obviously, back in Season 2, so we were talking about time, and that was Season 2, I remember back at Donington testing, that Hamlin and Andretti at that time, who are now obviously BMW Andretti, they couldn't get their Season 2 powertrain out of the garage. It was literally stuck in there for the majority of the test, and then they went out for the final day of the test with the Season 1 powertrain, because the Season 2 powertrain basically wouldn't get off the ground, so they had to revert back to last season's powertrain. But it was a really interesting story, this one, because obviously, you know, they were the big story of testing. As a journalist, and as you'll see in Formula 1 testing, there's always that story. Remember going back to like McLaren and Honda and all that, all this with the car not working, and Williams, for example, last season with not being at testing. It's the big story. Every journalist is looking to try and find out what's going on with the big story. And Amin and Andretti, unfortunately for them, that was the big story. So it sort of started because I then sort of like popped in at that time, and Chris will remember that we could just pop into the garage and actually ask the team principals, like mechanics, what was going on. And
those were the days, right?
Those were the days. I remember. Now you can't just walk in. They've all got their velvet ropes out. Back then there was no such thing as velvet ropes or boards that they would put up in front of in F1. So I went into the garage, and obviously I spoke to team members, and they sort of told me situations, and but then I was told to come back one day to the garage after testing, and they walked me through basically their problems and what they were trying to do to fix it. And that was fine. I was like, great, that's fine. I'm very happy for that. So obviously then after testing, after the end of that day, I went to the garage. I opened the garage door, knocked on the door, opened the door, and then I sort of peered my head in, and no one was there. It was empty. There was only 2 mechanics working on the car, and the press officer was just in the corner finishing up some emails. So I went up to the 2 mechanics. I was like, boys, is there someone around that I could talk to about, obviously, the powertrain and what's been going on? They went, sorry, mate, there's no one here. They've all gone home, so you'll have to talk to us tomorrow, probably. I was like, all right, no worries. And then all of a sudden, the press officer, who's really lovely, and I'm not going to name anyone, but at the same thing, she just came at me, and I was like, whoa. She was like, oh, this is really unprofessional that you keep coming in and trying to talk and trying to find out and snoop. And I was like, I'm just trying to, do my job, essentially. Like, just find a story about what's actually going on. And I was just getting this, I was basically getting told off for coming to the garage and snooping, basically, and trying to find out what the story is. And I was like, whoa. And it sort of goes back to Season 1, because I had an interview arranged with Andretti at the time, and it didn't go through on that day. And then I spoke to the person I wanted to speak to later that day, and that got thrown back at me at testing because I did that. And in my head, I didn't say it, but in my head I was like, but I had an interview arranged with that person during that day. And I was like, so when I saw him, I explained the situation and said, I was supposed to have an interview with you at 1:00. It didn't happen because, things happen. I understand that things change on a race day. Is it okay if we can do it now? And we did. We had a great interview. But then because obviously they were having those problems and so forth, and then you've got me snooping around with other journalists, obviously trying to find out the story as well. And I think the frustration obviously boiled up, and everything that was going on with that team at the time, and obviously the frustration of not getting the car out, I think it just boiled over, and boom. There you go, I sort of got a big telling off. But at the same time, I was like, I was only doing my job. But yeah, that was my interesting story from the paddock. I've got loads more, and I'm sure I'll go into them at some point.
See, Jack, this is the thing for me, having been in journalism and now working in PR, is that I can totally sympathise with both sides of that story, because you are both just doing your jobs, and it's painful sometimes.
Oh. Yeah, I know. It's just the way it is, I suppose. I understand their side. Obviously, it's not a great story. Your brand, your company, your race team cannot get your car out of the garage, and you've had to revert to the Season 1 powertrain while everyone else is loving their Season 2 powertrain, and you're stuck in last year's technology. It's not a great look. I understood that. But at the same time, I was trying to be positive. I was trying to be like, what are you trying to do to fix it? How can you get this car out? How hard are the team working? Give me some positive energy to sort of combat the bad story. But they just weren't having it.
Do you know what's hilarious? If we would have been more focused on Trulli if they were actually at the track.
Yeah, they weren't there.
They were okay. Technically, they were.
They did turn up
because do you remember it was back when all the teams were based at Donington, apart from one of them, I think. So all they had to do was push the car out of the factory, across the car park, and then into the garage. It took 5 minutes, and so technically they were at Donington. But
They weren't in the
didn't.
garage.
They weren't in the garage for like 3 days. More than that, it was. Oh god, you had 6 days of testing back then, didn't you? So they didn't turn up until the final day at all.
Yes. Well, it's crazy times that they were. Chris, I'm sure you've been in the paddock just as long as me. I'm sure you've got a cool story to talk about.
So you asked me to come up with a cool story, and I don't know if there is a particular cool story, because like most of the time I think they all just like amalgamate into one, because most of the time it's like most of the stories involve you get your work done, and then you clock off for the day and you find whatever local pub does some really good beer, and then you enjoy merriments for the evening, and then flight home on Sunday. And that usually it's not really safe for work. So on a similar note of like battling the communications methods, having seen it from both sides, was how awful I felt when Albon was supposed to be in Formula E and then suddenly got accosted by Toro Rosso, which we all know how that's worked out now. But I was desperately trying to work out what the hell was going on with Albon, because he was there, he was at the test, and he had the gear on and everything, but his car weren't going nowhere. And he, I think if I remember rightly, he said that there was an issue with the car. So they were like covering up, but obviously by this point we know he's going to Formula One, and I had the late Jean-Paul Drio kind of explaining, kind of how he had a call from I think he had either a call from Helmut Marko or from Franz Tost during the Japanese Grand Prix, like, oh, we want Albon, and I thought that it was a bad idea, and so context. Right, this was a time when like Red Bull's junior pool was like really dry. They had pulled Hartley back after ditching him. They were putting Kvyat back in the car because frankly they didn't have anyone else. And now they were going to steal a driver from Nissan that they ditched 4 years prior or something like that, to stick him back in the car when they just put Gasly in the Red Bull. Now, no one could have predicted how badly Gasly would have done in that Red Bull. So I maintain what I said at the time, which was that Albon should have turned that drive down, because as far as anyone was concerned, there was no long-term future with Red Bull, because like Max and Pierre, that was a super young lineup, and presumably was going to be super fast because Gasly was very impressive in the Toro Rosso, and that surely is a long-term partnership and lineup that they've just created. So what is Albon going to do at Toro Rosso? And I said the safer option, especially for a guy who had to be like bailed out by Drio to continue racing in F2 the previous year, or that same year it was actually. The safer bet for him was to stay with Nissan, manufacturer drive in a great up and coming championship, very respected, security for like could have had a WEC deal alongside it as well if he wanted with another team, and he'd have been set up for the rest of his career. And looking back on it now, people like to still bring up the fact that I wrote this piece about why he should turn the drive down, and it's not. I maintain what I said at the time.
It just didn't work out the way you expected.
Just did not work out how I thought it would. How anyone would, to be honest.
Yeah, I know. It was a crazy story. I remember I had an interview with Oliver Rowland actually a couple of weeks. He got the phone call Sunday night saying, I think we need you in Valencia. Could you come? Just to test the car. So you're saying Alex Albon was there. Oliver Rowland ended up being there as well. I don't know if you saw him because I wasn't there. So Oliver Rowland was there as well, and he was just lounging about the back because he couldn't get in the car because there was contract issues, and ended up not even driving the car. So he was there for testing, but he said it was just crazy, and he said he didn't even know by the end of testing if he was going to drive the car. They said to him, "You might do the first race in Saudi Arabia. You might do the first race, and then we'll try and find someone." And then he said 2 hours later he got another phone call, and he said, "Do you want to actually just drive the whole season?" And I went, yeah. So no surprise, right? But that's the story of to finish up that story, that's how Oliver Rowland got the seat. He got the phone call Sunday night before testing even started to say that we might need you.
Yeah, it's a great deal for Rowland, though, because he was great in F2 with Dams, I should point out as well. So that's where the connection came. Yeah, because Drio had like 20, 30 drivers on the phone asking about the seat. And it worked out great for Rowland because he didn't really have like much lined up, if I remember rightly. I mean, he was still like Williams' young driver at that point, but like a race seat in Formula One was not looking likely. So big winner out of all of this was Oliver Rowland, who, remember, Rookie of the Year he was. I mean, podiums and pole positions and leading races and beating the Season 2 champion that people regard as the best Formula E driver, certainly statistically the most successful. So, what a year for Ollie Rowland.
It was. Indeed it was. Now, Jack, I know you've only been to one race. You went to the Rome race last year. So just to finish off our paddock stories, how did you find your first ever race? Because I remember mine back in Monaco for the first season. It's just surreal. Like, you can't believe that you're actually in it.
Yeah, well, I've been to many races as a fan, but Rome in 2018, that was my first race actually as an FIA accredited journalist, and I'll be honest, I don't think I was that professional at all. But yeah, that's something obviously that's going to come with time. I was supposed to be in Paris next weekend. Obviously, I'm not. But yeah, no, my first weekend as a journalist in Formula E was so surreal, mainly because like I'd seen like the pits and stuff from afar in like when I'd been to Battersea in Paris. But to actually like walk up and down the pit lane, just like, oh, there's Jean-Paul Drio. I had known Nichols over I'd had a couple conversations with Nichols, Jack Nichols, sorry. I just call him Nichols because we're both called Jack. So yeah, I'd had a couple conversations with him over Facebook or Twitter. He's in a Formula E Facebook group, and so I chatted to him through there, but he seemed to just recognise me immediately, which was pretty surreal. So yeah, I talked with Jack a bit over the course of the weekend. Bumped into Vernon Kay on the Friday, and he thought he already knew me, so love that from Vernon. But yeah, no, it was just incredibly surreal just to actually be in the paddock. A side note to it all is, but I was writing for a different site at the time, and I'd kind of gone over the top of my of my boss's like head and brought my mate into the paddock so he could be a cameraman, which he wasn't happy about because the thing is, we went to Rome not knowing if we were actually going to be in the paddock because we had been told that our things had been our passes had been revoked because I'd let him in, but but we still got like all the press emails, so we went there thinking, okay, are we actually going to be in the paddock? So we went up to the accreditation centre and we actually got the passes, and I was at that point I was already buzzing, but to actually get into the media centre and then just walk around pit lane, I just found it so surreal. I spoke with Sam Bird, who won that race, afterwards, and I also spoke with Mark Preston. I doorstepped both of them about an hour after the race, and I'm not sure whether that was the best decision, but I got two fairly decent interviews out of it, so I'm still quite happy about it. But yeah, it was absolutely amazing. I can't wait to be back in the paddock because it's just gives me a buzz and just makes me just so excited, like a kid at Christmas.
I remember it. I remember mine. It's surreal.
So I remember mine. It was like 2 weeks after I picked up my A-level results, and you were there, Jack, because yes. I remember we met with the Formula Spy lot. That's how I got involved with them, and we had this moment in the pit lane where we went all American Psycho with the business cards.
Yes, I remember. Here's my card. Here's my card. Here's my card.
If you've seen American Psycho, you know the scene where they compare business cards. They're like, "Oh my god, I think it's even laminated," and stuff like that.
I'm gonna have to make some business cards for when this season. Well, if this season resumes and we do get to have a race, because if it is August September, I might be able to go out there. So, but yeah.
I'm glad you brought up Vernon because I have a Vernon story. So when did he join? Was it season 5?
He joined season 4 because that was his first season with Channel 5.
Yeah.
Because he was with Channel 5 at the time, and then in season 5 he joined the World Feed, and he's continued that into season 6. He's a lovely guy though. He's so lovely.
So I spoke to him in Rome last year in 2019. He was talking to Nikki. And I went to it was the first race I'd attended that season, apart from Marrakesh, I think. And it was probably the first time I'd spoken to Nikki since testing. So I went over to congratulate her about her baby, and Vernon was just talking to her and complaining about how his hotel room didn't have AC, and then he just turns to me. And we had never really met properly. And Vernon just turns to me and goes, "Has your hotel room got AC working?" I went, "No." Yeah, it does. It does, Vernon.
I love that from Vernon. And I know that we're very, very swiftly running out of time. But in his first broadcast on Channel 5, just during the grid walk, because this is something that I will remember forever. He kind of, whilst doing the grid walk, he kind of addressed his mates whilst he was on television because he said, he basically said, if any of my mates are watching this, I'll get us a couple passes and then we can have a good old duck do. And that is just that quote has just stuck with me ever since. And just genuinely, I did want to ask him about that in Rome. What is a duck do? But
I think we can figure what duck do is.
Yeah. I'd never heard it before until he said it on air. So yeah,
I can only assume he means one thing. But
yes.
There's one thing, just before we wrap up and end the show, the one thing I think I'm surprised Formula E haven't actually done with Vernon Kay is any family fortune jokes. I just want him to go on the grid and go, do you think, ask whoever's on pole, do you think you'll win? And then he goes, our survey says, and then it's like,
yeah, well, yeah, Jack, when we had a Skype or Discord chat a couple months ago, and you mentioned this to me, so yeah, I think it's brilliant. Formula E fortunes should definitely happen.
It needs to be a YouTube show. Formula E.
Oh, 100%.
If you're watching, you can have that one for free. Okay,
yeah.
Boys, I think we could probably go on for days, but we've got to call it quits. But Chris, thank you so much for coming on. I've really loved your insights today.
Oh, cheers for having me on. It's always good to catch up.
Pleasure as always.
Thank you.
If you're enjoying the content, please remember hit that like button. If you're really enjoying it, really want to keep hold and keep watching every show, then hit that subscribe button because you'll never miss a show. You've been watching the FEZ show. We won't be back on Monday because there's a bank holiday. Technically today is a bank holiday, but we won't be back on Monday, but we'll be back on Tuesday and then carrying on all the way till Friday. So we'll see you then. Goodbye.